Hi again. In this video, I'm going to give a brief introduction to transportation planning that will help give you a sense of what we'll be talking about over the next 6 weeks in this course, and hopefully what you might expect to get out of it. So to start off with, let's talk about what transportation is. In this definition that I poached from Robert Severo's article that you're going to be reading this next session, he says that transportation is the movement of people, goods, and ideas. And one of the things I like about this is that it's not just saying it's movement, which is fairly obvious, but it points out that in transportation we're talking about not only moving people around, which is I think what many of us often jump to with transportation. Certainly we're going to be talking probably mostly in this class about moving people. But it's also important to remember that we're talking about goods, and that's increasingly obvious in this day and age with COVID because we're getting lots and lots of things delivered to our houses. And so transportation is about those things and the systems and the infrastructure, even the companies that make those deliveries. And then also increasingly sort of obvious in this COVID time is that transportation is about ideas. In theory, a lot of the stuff we move around, maybe we wouldn't have to actually physically move if we could just transport ideas. And so in some sense, me conveying this to you over video and the internet is a form of transportation. There's, at least in theory, the possibility of substituting a certain amount of movement, physical movement, with the movement of ideas. The other thing that we really frequently talk about with transportation is this question of what does it mean to have better transportation, or like how would we optimize a transportation system? And at its most basic level, we might think about, moving things between one place and another. And maybe if you were to move more things, or if you were to move them faster, then that would give you a better form of transportation. And certainly that's been a goal in a lot of transportation planning. But in transportation studies, we really often juxtapose the concept of moving more things with the concept of moving to more places. And the fancy terms that we use for those that we'll get into next session are mobility, which is moving more, and accessibility, which is accessing more things. And one of the things that this relationship between mobility and accessibility, or really even a dichotomy between mobility and accessibility, points out is that transportation is not just about movement, it's about what you're getting to. It's about the opportunities that are afforded. And in that sense, it's really sort of inherently about land use. So surprise, this is a transportation class, but it's actually also really a land use class. Okay, so now that we understand broadly what transportation is, how might we go about planning for it? So the more complete quote from Severo's article is planning for the movement of people, goods, and ideas. That's what transportation planning is. And there are several different facets to that we're going to be talking about in this class. The first we might call goals, and that's this idea of what we want to achieve. And so looking back to our previous discussion about accessibility and mobility, maybe those are two different goals or two sort of complementary goals that we might try to achieve through transportation planning, either more mobility or more accessibility or a combination of the two. There's also this question of policy, which is what we should do to achieve those goals. So, even if we have a goal, we have to understand how we can use the different institutions that we have in place in our government or our economic systems in order to try to achieve those goals in a reasonable way. And then there are also a lot of design questions that come into transportation planning. So, what infrastructure is needed, where will it go, and what will it look or feel like? We get design involved from the perspective of engineering, how we build systems on a very practical level, or make our bridges stand up and, make sure that our roadway systems are safe and can accommodate the types of vehicles that drive on them. But there's also a lot of design in transportation that sometimes gets overlooked that has more to do with the look and feel and user experience of those systems and how those might encourage or discourage people from using them. And then finally, there's this really sort of important overarching piece that's about finance. How might we pay for transportation systems? Transportation financing is incredibly complex, and we're just really going to scratch the surface of it in this class. But it's important to note that even if we have the right goals and the informed policy and great designs, if we can't figure out how to finance these things, they're never really going to get off the ground. And so we'll be touching a little bit on the financial part of transportation planning as well. And answering all these questions relies on, as you might expect, connections to lots of different disciplines, and thus this course will be fairly interdisciplinary. So you can see at the middle of this diagram, we're talking about transporting passengers and freight and information, as I described at the beginning of this video, and then those are connected to environmental studies, engineering, technology, policy and planning, history, social sciences like sociology and demography, economics, math and computer science. There are lots of different fields that are involved in transportation planning. And I actually think that's one of the most exciting things about it, is that you can really get into it and make a big difference from a lot of different angles. And so I'm actually really excited to see that in the class list for this class, folks are coming from all sorts of different majors that are represented in this diagram, and some that aren't. And that's terrific, because I think there's a place for all of us to fit into that conversation in one way or another, and go out and work on transportation with those backgrounds. So to investigate how urban transportation systems work and how we can plan them, we're going to be looking at a variety of case studies. We'll be looking at different types of transportation infrastructure designed for different modes, and consider how their effectiveness can be evaluated. Here, for example, is the bike lane that's on Market Street in San Francisco. This is actually an outdated photograph in the sense that Market Street has been completely revamped, but you can see there's a counter there next to the bike lane. So we'll be thinking about how different infrastructures in the context of a roadway or in other transportation environments might be integrated with one another, and how we think about what makes a successful piece of infrastructure. We'll also look at how transportation systems are developed and how these developments are influenced by really big picture policy and economics. This is a photo of the Bay Bridge with the old Bay Bridge right next to it. This was an enormously complicated project involving financing from the local, state, and national levels, and players sort of all across that political and economic spectrum. And that's a really common facet of transportation problems, is that they are incredibly complex politically and economically, and often go over budget, and just necessitate interaction and hopefully cooperation between a lot of different players. And so we'll be looking into how some of that works. And then we'll also be looking at how transportation has evolved through time and make some comparisons across different geographies. So the course is primarily focused on the United States, and it draws pretty heavily on local examples from the Bay Area, but we'll also look at some examples from other regions and countries. So for example, here is Shattuck Avenue on the left, right? I say here with quotes in Berkeley because only some of us are in Berkeley these days, but if you are on the Berkeley campus regularly, you might recognize that view down Shattuck that's almost looking straight at where the BART station is these days. And we'll be thinking in this course about some of the really substantial changes that have happened since the 1940s when this photo was taken, and today, including that there are no streetcars on Shattuck Avenue anymore. And on the right, we have a photo from Kunming, China, which shows the enormous development over the last several decades of automobile infrastructure in China. Increasingly, the automobile paradigm that was developed in the United States starting mid-century has really spread around the world, and it can no longer be considered a U.S. phenomenon. One thing that I'm really looking forward to this summer, with actually so many of you being in different places, is the opportunity to draw on examples from your personal experiences in those places. So hopefully over the course of the 6 weeks, we'll have lots of opportunities for you to bring in some of the things that you're seeing maybe outside of your windows in different parts of the country or the world that we can use to gain experience collectively about those diverse places. So by the end of this course, we have 3 main goals. The first is to understand how transportation systems develop and influence other aspects of urban form. So this is really about the history of transportation development and that interaction that I described back at the beginning of the video about the really strong relationship between transportation and the form and the land uses of the urban environment. They really can't be separated. Secondly, we want to be able to evaluate the pros and cons of contemporary transportation policy agendas. So thinking about different transportation modes, for example, that we might be encouraging through contemporary policy, and what the pluses and minuses might be of making shifts from one mode to another. And then a third really important part of the course is to foster a sense of participation for you as informed citizens. So, you'll be gaining experience with transportation enough that you can go out and shape the transportation landscape yourself, whether that's by participating in a public meeting or maybe even moving in the direction of a career in transportation, where you could help shape some of the policy, the design, the economics, etc., all of these constituent parts that go into forming the transportation landscape.